Hey, deserving listeners, it's just me today. I thought I would answer some patron emails, upper tier patron. This email is from anonymous highest tier patron from Minneapolis. He writes, I was hoping you could share your thoughts on this. I have been in therapy on and off for about 10 years. However, I have an issue where I find myself regularly switching therapists. I generally work with someone for about a year or so before I start becoming dissatisfied with my therapist. I often feel like I'm not being challenged enough or making any progress. Now I am finding myself in the same situation where I want to switch therapists, but I'm not sure if I should. On one hand, working with different people may provide me with exposure and experience with many different types of modalities and techniques. On the other hand, this may just be me being unwilling to confront issues with my current therapist. Any insight into regularly switching therapists would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. End of email. Well, I can't know for you in particular, anonymous higher tier patron from Minneapolis, but these are the questions I would ask myself if I were in your shoes. And I've experienced this myself. I mean, not to that degree, but I've had times in therapy myself where I feel like I'm not really being challenged enough, or I feel like I'm not making any progress. It feels like I'm just coming in and we're talking about the same things, and I kind of know what my therapist is going to say. For me, when I get there, I'm like, well, there's a lot that I'm avoiding. There's a lot that I could be talking about in therapy that I don't naturally go to when I sit down on the couch. But if I really thought about it, I mean, there's some deeper, perhaps more vulnerable things. So I don't know, highest tier patron, but if you are on the avoidant side of the spectrum, attachment-wise, then in all likelihood, this is a worthy exploration for you. What vulnerable, embarrassing, deeper issue are you avoiding? And when you get to the point where it would be natural to start talking about that, you bolt. An analogous situation that's more common is in romantic relationships with avoidant people, where I've worked with people who have a deep amount of avoidant attachment style due to childhood emotional neglect. And they will be convinced that their relationship is pointless. They'll be married and they'll just be like, yeah, I'm just not in love anymore. I don't feel it. I just feel like there's nothing really terrible about the relationship, but I have my complaints, but yeah, I just, every day I just think I need to leave. And so I really feel like I need to break up. So as a therapist, I will absolutely support them if they want to break up. It's not my life that they're living. So there's that. But if I have an inkling, or at best a full assessment of the individual as being avoidantly attached, then I will explore with them the possibility that what they're doing is actually avoiding going deeper, or when in doubt, they run, right? And the longer a relationship sustains itself, the more vulnerable it just inherently becomes. That's why all of us in the beginning of a relationship, we have a much easier time not being triggered typically. But as a relationship lengthens in time and deepens and becomes more a part of our neurons, our brain becomes more used to these individuals, and we start to attach to them in some very deep primordial ways. All of those triggers and transferences and distortions and worries and schemas start to emerge. And so with avoided people, the conscious thought will be, I'm not in love, I need to leave. Again, if they want to leave, I support that. But I've been with avoidant clients where they will leave, even after we explore it fully, and even after the client is on board with it, like, yeah, maybe I am avoiding. Let's look at that. Maybe I should be vulnerable. Maybe I should dig deeper. Am I running away like I always do? And then let's say they do leave after 6 months of exploration and therapy. And then fast forward another few months, and the client comes back to me and says, I made a terrible mistake. I never actually should have left my spouse because I am deeply in love and I miss my partner and I want to be back with them. And it's clear now that it was my avoidant tendencies. I was fully consciously thinking that I need to leave, but subconsciously, clearly, I was still in love and wanting to be vulnerable, but I couldn't because of my relational traumas. And I can't stop thinking about my partner. All I want to do is get back with them. So I've been with avoidant people as they do that, and it's possible that that's what's happening with these therapists. Now, if you're not on the avoidant end of the spectrum, then none of this applies to you, anonymous higher-tier patron. So it could be, not the specifics of it. It could, regardless of your attachment style tendencies, it could absolutely be this phenomenon of wanting to avoid deeper things. Just think about, make a list, maybe write out 10 things that you tend not to talk about with your therapist that you feel like maybe aren't necessarily super relevant, because it's possible that they are. Or just go into your therapist and say, normally I want to bolt, but I'm wondering if there's something that I'm avoiding. Can you help me explore that? Because I don't want to just terminate with you like I've done in the past and end up in the same cycle. So can we explore that? Something like that. But it's also possible that you benefit from a therapist for a while and then it's over. It's not common that it's usually that amount of time, that brief amount of time of about a year, but it's very common, in fact, almost universal, that after a certain amount of time, clients will find that unless they're really needing that attachment figure of the therapist, it is often helpful to switch therapists because of the reasons that you laid out. Maybe it's 3 years or 5 years or something, but eventually you just sort of learn all the different things that your therapist has to say. You've internalized all the things that they have to give, and you're looking for a fresh point of view, a new point of view, and there's nothing pathological about that at all. But really, this question applies to all y'all out there in therapy, or if you're thinking about starting therapy again, is what are you avoiding? Because I guarantee you, in all likelihood, there's a very strong likelihood that all of you are avoiding something in therapy. There's something that is too deep, that is too vulnerable, that's too scary, that's too embarrassing, that you think is too shameful. Now, it doesn't mean that you're supposed to talk about it right away, but definitely identify that as a target to move towards, something that you can shoot for to eventually talk about, because you deserve that. There can be a lot of growth and material in that discussion, particularly if you find your sessions to be kind of bland and not super eventful. And if you're a therapist, and of course you know this, but if you're a therapist and you have clients that seem to just skip along the surface, particularly if this is well into the therapeutic relationship, 6+ months, then there are techniques as a therapist to introduce the idea with your clients that maybe there's other things to talk about. Like I'm just trying to think of there's a million different ways that I might do it, but I might start out a session. I might think about a client in between sessions and think, I feel like we've kind of hit a rut or a stagnation. So I might at the beginning of a session say something like, look, I've been thinking a lot about you and the course of your therapy, and I don't know, but it feels like we've kind of hit a plateau in therapy, but I don't know. I don't know how you feel, so I'd like to hear how you feel about it. So I'd ask them, and then I'd hear from them, and then I'd say, well, there's a possibility that we've hit a plateau because you are scared of revealing something, or your normal mode is to avoid even acknowledging that these things are important to you, or you downplay them, or you think that I'll shame you or something. Does anything come to mind when I bring that up? And I might also say, look, you don't have to I don't want to push you to bring something up that you're not ready to bring up, but I just want to throw it out there as something to talk about. We can talk about talking about something that you don't want to talk about, or you could just tell me and we could experiment and see how that goes. But I'm really curious as to the full you and all your glory, even the parts of you that you think are embarrassing or shameful or uninteresting or unworthy or something. I'm really interested in all that. I want to know the full you. So, I might say something like that. Okay, so this next email is going to talk about suicide in kind of a graphic way. So I would skip forward by 15 minutes if that is triggering for you. All right, this next email is from annual upper tier patron Kim from Arizona. Good old Kim. She says, have you ever seen the documentary film called The Bridge by Eric Steele. Heavy trigger warning, by the way, about suicide. It is an extreme, intense, emotional, and controversial film, but I also found it deeply moving and one I watch every 2 or 3 years. A filmmaker filmed the Golden Gate Bridge for 1 year and captured many suicide jumps. The filmmaker displays footage of the suicides and interviews the families. There is so much there that you could react to, like the stories of the deceased, their family perspectives, etc. Just chiming in here. Yeah, I saw the movie back when it came out, 2006, and apparently it's on Amazon Prime right now. And it's a fascinating movie. It is just as you describe it, a filmmaker for a year, because I think statistics, something like a few hundred or more back then, people would complete suicide by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. And so he got a few cameras, and would just film with these really long lenses, very zoomed in. And so there was a lot of ethical questions about it because he didn't intervene. And so you would think that you should, right? If you see someone that looks like they might kill themselves, shouldn't you run out there and try to help them? Shouldn't you try to stop them, or call the authorities, or call a therapist or a mental health professional to go out there and try to prevent them from doing that? Maybe they did that sometimes, but at the very least, there were many times when they didn't. And watching the other ethical question is just watching the documentary to begin with, because why are you watching, right? Are you watching just to watch people die? You have some sort of sick pleasure in watching people kill themselves. So there's that. But the message of the movie to me, when I watched the documentary called The Bridge, is it's not exploitative of the individuals. And sure, they could have made a documentary video where they actually try to stop people, and that would have been fine as well. But one of the experiences or the realities of suicide, which happens all the time, the amount of worry that we all have about gun deaths in our country, the most frequent use of a gun is not to kill another person, it's to kill the self. It's used in suicide. So all of the news coverage and all the paranoia and all the political ups and downs of guns and murder and police, and the problem pales in comparison to suicide in our society. And it's getting worse, suicide, for people of all ages, by the way. So it's a problem, and to ignore it, which is what we usually do, is part of the problem. So what this documentary does is it really exposes people. It's a rare document that really, in a very observer-oriented way, provides an audience with the reality of what it is to kill oneself. It doesn't show the graphic details, but it does show the people contemplating, there's these long shots of someone kind of walking back and forth on the bridge, and then they climb over the rail, and then they kind of think about it for a while, and then maybe a half an hour later you see them jump, and then they if they pan well enough, they see that the body splash into the water below. And this movie is obviously very triggering, so you shouldn't be watching it if you're at risk of being traumatized by this or just negatively affected by it. But when I watched it, it was very affecting and very gripping at watching. So one message that the movie is putting forth is, look, this is the reality. This is happening all the time, and we tend to ignore it. So let's look at it. We need to see it first and understand it before we can actually face it and do something about it, right? The second message that is clear, at least from my memory of watching the documentary almost 20 years ago, is that people, if you give them the help that they deserve and need, they actually don't want to kill themselves. Like, there was one individual that survived, had jumped from the bridge and had injured themselves severely upon landing on the water, but had survived and been rescued or something. And they interviewed him, I think it was him, and he talked about how he no longer wants to kill himself. And he talked about how, as he was falling, he regretted having jumped or something like that. And the message that I got from it was that people who are even at that stage of wanting to take their own life, wanting to die by suicide, are salvageable, are savable. These individuals, if they have a connection, if they're given some way out of the way that they feel, then they won't do this. And it's the isolation, it's the demoralization, it's the lack of treatment that will lead to this behavior, right? Now, having said all that, I can absolutely imagine this documentary prompting people to attempt and complete suicide. The documentary is so matter of fact and so just a document of suicide that I know absolutely that this documentary could absolutely prompt someone if they were thinking about suicide, because it's a known phenomenon that when people are at risk of suicide and they hear about suicide or they watch a suicide, they learn about a suicide, it can motivate them to take that final step to actually attempting, because there's a normalization or an inspiration of it. And we do this in all aspects of life. Like if you watch a YouTube video of someone making an interesting dinner, that could inspire you that day to go out and buy ingredients and make dinner, right? We are inspired by watching other humans do things that we're on the cusp of doing ourselves. So there's that. Also, videos like this can make it seem like it's an answer, right? If someone isn't even necessarily even thinking about suicide, but when they watch these individuals dying, it can prompt someone to be like, well, maybe that's an answer for me. So I'm not going to say that this documentary is 100% a good for society, but the problem is in our society is that we just ignore the topic altogether anyway. And in order for us to help people and work on helping others and also eliminating the antecedents, the causes of suicide, we have to face this and we have to look at it. Now, in a perfect world, if someone was at risk of suicide, they wouldn't watch this documentary before they knew that it wasn't going to push them over the edge. They would have a number of clinicians, at least one good, solid clinician that they're working with. They would have a lot of support in their systems, their families, their job, their medical field, that kind of thing. And thus, this documentary wouldn't just be floating out in space, ready for some isolated individual to become motivated to take their own life. You know what I mean? So when we look at this documentary and we're like, hey, documentary, don't do this. Well, the documentary is, it's not the problem. The problem is our society. And if our society was different, this documentary wouldn't threaten as much as it does, right? But having said that, it still threatens a lot, is the point. It's sort of like with the TV show 13 Reasons Why, right? The Netflix show. And this was my position when that came out. And full disclosure, a good friend of mine wrote that show, Brian Yorkie. So you could take that into account. And he got, I'm pretty sure he caught a lot of flack for this, but the show depicts a suicide, or the show is all about suicide, right? The show is about a young woman, a teenage girl who kills herself, and before she does it, she records all these cassette tapes, and on each side of each cassette is one of the 13 reasons why she killed herself, and it has to do with, for my memory, it had to do with like one of the kids at school or something like that. So on, one of the sides of the cassettes is the story of how some other girl bullied her or something like this. The protagonist is listening to the tapes and sort of being pulled through the story like this. Anyway, so the TV show, in a sense, glorifies suicide because the girl who kills herself is in a really bad situation. Before she dies, she's traumatized and bullied and confused and isolated and sad, and then she kills herself. She records these tapes, and then these tapes proceed to cause this total change in the school because everyone that is on the tape has to face the reality that they were a factor in this girl dying. And so people are given a chance to learn or be called out or identified or shamed for their abusive behavior of her or something. And this is, for some people, this is their dream of a suicide. This is why they kill themselves, is because they hope that it will vindicate them and it will shame other people. And of course, we don't want that message to be out there. We don't want that to be glorified. We don't want to put that idea in people's heads, or we don't want to encourage people to do that. And at first, when the TV show came out, I actually did an episode about it years ago. And I saw that initial criticism, like, hey, you can't have a TV show that glorifies suicide. And my position was at the time was that I actually was appreciative of a show like this because it highlighted something that is rarely talked about. And I thought it was just overblown paranoia and panic around, oh my God, what are we going to do? Someone's talking about suicide. I'm like, look, this is a reality. In my world, this is happening all the time. People are thinking about it, attempting, completing all the time in my world. And this is one of those stories. And if you can't handle it, like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, how many things have you watched that have involved violent death and war? All the Marvel movies and stuff, like how many people die, how much violence happens in those movies. Like, you seem extremely okay with watching literally depictions of people dying, or documentaries about people dying by murder or riot or war or something. And yet when there's one story about suicide, suddenly the world is falling apart. Like, if you're really concerned about your kids, what about all the violence that they watch? Anyway, so at first I'm like, come on, people. But then the data came out and showed, we can't know if it's causal, of course, it's just a correlation, but there was a bump in teenage suicide following the months after that TV show came out. And it does stand to reason that the show could have inspired people who were thinking about it to complete or attempt. That does raise a concern. And so we need to think about that, and we need to be careful about that. And just having a disclaimer at the beginning of the TV show that says, hey, if you're thinking about suicide, call this hotline, that's not enough, right? That's not going to solve the problem. But in my head, this is not the fault of a TV show or a documentary. This is the fault of our society. If we had a different society with different systems in place and different levels of, or no level of stigma about this sort of thing, and resources available, then a TV show like this, a documentary like The Bridge, it wouldn't pose the threat that it does. And it would just be like, well, yeah, we know lots of stories of suicide. We know we acknowledge lots of suicides happen. And here's our full 15-step approach as a society, as how we're dealing with that and how we're trying to reduce it. So I feel like these TV shows, these documentaries, become kind of the scapegoat for us. We as a society are ignoring it, and we don't want to acknowledge it to begin with. And then someone comes out with some kind of story like this, and we're like, hey, suicide is your fault. And it's like, no, suicide is our fault. It's our fault that we as a society are ignoring it. We're not voting for politicians that allocate tax dollars to raise awareness, to spend in public health, to have it so that everyone has access to mental health care very quickly, very easily, so that social workers and public health workers are not overworked. We would want to hire like 10 times the amount of social workers and 10 times the amount of CPS workers and public health people, so that they would have the time and the resources to actually reach out and educate and help and change society. It's our fault that isn't in place. It's our fault that we have this epidemic of so many houses with guns that are potentially not even locked up, and there are people in those homes who are wanting to kill themselves, and a gun is in the drawer of their dad's desk, and it's a problem, and we're not doing anything to change that. And so it's not 13 Reasons Why fault. It's not The Bridge fault. It's our fault. And if you want to change it, vote, raise awareness, write your representative, talk about it, get the word out there. If you're in a position of power, if you're a teacher, talk about that, this with your school. How can you start integrating this more? And I know some of you are obviously doing these things, and I applaud you. All right, let's take a break. When we get back, more emails. All right, we're back from the break. This email is from upper tier patron Hannah from Indiana. Hannah from Indiana. She writes, I know you've talked on the podcast about child content creators and kids growing up with content creator parents. And I also have heard you talk about how the criticism you've received on YouTube has impacted you. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on my experience with being a YouTuber when I was a child and how that might compare to your experience as adult content creators and the experience of kids today. I began creating videos for YouTube in 2009 at the age of 11 years old. I made vlog-style videos right as vlogging was becoming popular. Just to come in here, yeah, I kind of forgot about that YouTube in the beginning was mainly geared towards vlogging, towards personal vlogging, right? People would just be like, so I went to the store today and this and that. And I remember people would really make fun of YouTube in the beginning, like who would want to watch that stuff? And of course, now it's something that we would all totally understand as to why people would want to watch it. Also, I think it's in the name, YouTube, right? Now, YouTube has major corporations, right? All the main, studios and TV channels, cable channels, TV shows, big TV shows, they all are on YouTube. So I remember thinking when YouTube was invented that the name was geared towards, look, this is supposed to be a look into your life. It's supposed to be very amateur and very unproduced. And of course, YouTube now, even people who are still just them doing a video at home, they're highly produced. They're better than, like, for me, when I sit down at night to veg out and just watch random stuff, I don't watch TV, I watch YouTube. There's so many different quality YouTube channels and videos on the internet that are just way better than stuff that's on regular TV, in my opinion. Aside from drama, obviously, like The Last of Us, which I just find to be an amazing show. Okay, going on here. I made vlog-style videos as vlogging was becoming popular. Today, many 11-year-olds have social media or make TikToks. As a result, there are many more protections in place for minors on the internet, and there is more awareness and social support for people who get hate online, which wasn't present when I was young at the age of 11 in 2009. I remember getting tons of hate comments on my videos. Many comments would be calling me ugly, telling me to kill myself, and one comment I vividly remember that said, "I hope you die a painful death and a bloody death." I was also bullied in school for making YouTube videos. Despite this, I continued making videos on a few different channels until 2017. I've also struggled with suicidal ideation since I was 9 years old, and I struggle with self-harm since I was 11. Today, I still struggle with suicidal ideation and have had massive issues with self-esteem. I know that many of these issues predate my YouTube channel, and I experienced many traumas in my life that impacted my development. However, I do think that my exposure to internet criticism so early must have had an impact. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how this early exposure to internet criticism can negatively impact development. I'd also be interested to hear if you think that the normalization of children creating content can actually be protective, since it has led to more robust regulations and offers more social support with shared experience. End of email. Yeah. So that last bit, I don't know if I'd thought about that so much, but I do think that the advent of more children themselves or being in these family YouTube videos has caused more scrutiny, and there have been some bad cases actually. So I'm recording this, in what's the date? Mid-March, and this episode will probably come out like mid-April, I'm guessing. I'm not sure, but around this time in early March, there was a really famous case of this family YouTuber where they wrapped their kid, looks maybe like 3-4 years old, in looked to be like plastic or saran wrap, and he was just like a plastic burrito, if you will. And the dad was picking him up and standing him up on the bed and then pushing him down and standing him up and pushing him down. The kid didn't look happy. It didn't look horrific, but it did not look good. And the dad was also kind of making fun of the kid as he was pushing him down. And CPS was called because, from my understanding, the viewers were so outraged and they knew where the family lived, so they called the local CPS of that family, and CPS came to the house and actually took the kid away, which I found to be extremely strange. So in the video, it didn't look good. But in my experience with Child Protective Services, they need a lot of data to justify taking a kid out of a home. There's a lot of myths about Child Protective Services, and one of the myths is that they're just champing at the bit to take kids out of homes. The fact is they're not. Child Protective Services, they're interested in the child. They're not interested in punishing parents. They're interested in the best case scenario for the kid. So there are two scenarios. One is that the child wasn't really being that abused. There wasn't a pattern of abuse, and the parents made a really bad choice with this one video. And CPS arrived, and they, for whatever reason, overreacted. Maybe because of the internet scrutiny, they were worried of being accused of underreacting, or they were particularly outraged by the video, or they had some kind of bone to pick with YouTubers or something. So that's one possibility. It's not unheard of, but that could have happened. The other scenario is that they arrived and they investigated and found a lot more allegations and reasons to temporarily take the kid out of the home to protect the child. So that's another scenario that's possible. The mother went online and made this very teary apology video and took full responsibility, and the dad, to my knowledge, might not have, but the parents were obviously very distraught that the kid was gone and they couldn't get the kid back. I think the kid was in custody for a couple of days or something. It's pretty awful for a parent to go through, the shame and the worry of the kid. But CPS generally doesn't want to do this for a number of reasons unless it's justified. The reasons are that, one, they don't have a lot of places to put kids. It costs money. You have to, because you can't charge the parents, right? You have to use tax dollars to pay for these foster homes to foster the kids. And it can be expensive. And there's only so much money to allocate to this sort of thing. So they don't have, unlimited resources to pay for homes to take kids in. The second reason is that CPS workers are generally rational, intelligent, wise people who will weigh the pros and the cons. So they might have, if it was that first scenario where there wasn't other reasons to believe there was other abuse happening to the kid, then the CPS workers would come in and say, look, you need to make some changes, but we're not going to take the kid out of the home because we believe that by doing that, that would harm the kid. Because just imagine for the kid to be 48 hours-ish in this random home, and we, God knows what he's going through emotionally. I mean, that could permanently scar a child. And is that really what you want as CPS? So you're always weighing those pros and cons. Well, even if the kid is being abused in that home, it might actually be worse for the kid to take him out of the home. Instead, maybe we should actually try to get the parents to stop doing what they're doing. I did this work all the time. I would actually be called by these CPS workers, by the state workers, and they would say, the kid is being left in the home, but we need you to immediately go to this house, evaluate the situation, and fix this family so they stop abusing their kid. It was much less expensive to do this, even though I wasn't exactly cheap, but it was a lot more expensive to take kids out of the home. And it also lent itself towards the greater good, because most kids, when they're taken out of the home, it's not permanent. And it's better to try to work with the situation, right, and change it than to just rip it all apart. So I don't know what happened there, but why did I get on that topic? So here's my point, is that you were wondering if that the normalization of children being on the internet, on YouTube, TikTok, this kind of thing, has led to more rational approaches and regulations around this sort of thing. And we're far from that, actually, at this point. From my understanding, I don't know the laws specifically, but from my understanding, there are laws about having kids on like a television show, on a regular television show. Like if you're going to have kids on Star Trek, for example, there are very strict laws and regulations around labor, around consent, around all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to making a YouTube video, it's not considered to be like Star Trek. It's considered to be like your own private Facebook page or something, right? It's just a parent taking video of their kid and posting it. They have the right to do that in most jurisdictions, right? But what what's the difference between Star Trek having a child actor and these very lucrative YouTube channels with families that have kids on and the families make their money from these videos, that kind of thing, or at least it's in that direction. So should there be laws around it? And I would argue absolutely there should be. And I think reality TV shows might also kind of be off the hook in some ways. I can't remember, but the point is that children need to be protected. And my general policy, and it's kind of case by case, but generally speaking, my policy is don't do it. Don't have kids in your videos. Don't have kids on reality TV. You can certainly have kids as child actors at times, but there needs to be heavy regulations, because there are so many stories that we hear about kids being exploited in various different ways for labor or sexuality, being traumatized, right? Being taught that their only worth is how famous they are or how good they look or this sort of stuff. So there needs to be more regulation, and I don't know exactly how that would look, but generally speaking, when in doubt, no, just don't. We don't need kids to be on YouTube. We don't need kids to be in reality television shows. The TV shows will be fine without the kids. Don't take the risk. That's just flat out. What they'll say now is like, well, we have consent of the kid. The kid signed in the dotted line. Well, my position is, and it's obvious, that can you really know that a 10-year-old child or even a 15-year-old child knows what they're consenting to really? Do we really know that they know what they're signing off on? And the answer is absolutely not. There's no way that a kid understands what the consequences will be down the line if they actually consent to being on a show like this, right? And you dangle money out in front of them and fame, and you have a parent that's pressuring them to do it. There's a lot of reasons why you would make up justifications for it. And again, like I said, there's no reason to do it. We don't have to have it. And there carries a risk that we all understand. So it just shouldn't. Now, I don't think that the majority of kids in situations like this are being traumatized. We hear about seemingly the outliers, but it's hard to know, right? It's hard to know. And like I said, it's not worth it. We don't need it. So is this normalization of this sort of content raising awareness, and thus there are more protections in place, both legally and maybe socially? Yeah, but I think we're far from it. The other thing you ask is, might this experience that you had as an early vlogger, might it have traumatized you? And the answer is absolutely yes. As someone myself, I've been traumatized. To this day, I have behaviors in my life that are out of fear and terror that I went through, particularly during the trial. But it predates that. Like one of the things, and it's kind of a good, or it's, I don't know, there's a pro and a con. One of the things that I am doing now that I didn't do before is I'm much more heavily editing my videos and my audio episodes. And of course, that's a good thing because I'm spending more time making sure it's a good product, and I see it that way. But sometimes I'm spending way too much time editing everything because I'm terrified, not necessarily because I'm trying to make a better product, but because I've been terrorized by the trolls and by the haters and by the mobs of people who are trying to get me. I'm living in a state of fear, and that is not a place anyone deserves to be, and it's also not a good place to be as a content provider. And I went through the traumas in my 40s and 50s. I have a lot more support, a lot more power, a lot more resilience than a young person would. So if I was traumatized by it, then yeah, at the age of 11, when you're going through this. So it sounds like from your story that you were traumatized a lot as a child, and then you turned to the internet as either a creative endeavor or maybe even a therapeutic endeavor, maybe both. And then you get some support and maybe some gratification, but you also get these horrific comments that I'm hoping you saw them as just being trolls, but it's hard not to let it get under your skin. And now you're like, well, I have this problem with my self-esteem and other kinds of issues. How much of it is YouTube and how much of it was predated YouTube? It's impossible to know, but absolutely it could be affecting you. And it's just like any other trauma. Like when you are verbally abused by one of your parents for 5 years or 10 years, we all understand that that's a lifetime of struggle from that internalized voice will be with you the rest of your life. And maybe even the tendency to be verbally abusive yourself will be with you the rest of your life, or to tolerate verbal abuse in your partner when you're raising kids or something. It's just, we all understand that it's stuck in there to some extent. We can become aware of it. Awareness is power. We can work on it. We can heal from it. We can have corrective experiences around it. We can get lots of therapy for it. But we're never going to fully become a person that didn't go through that. And the same goes for this sort of stuff. I'm personally probably always, I guess, I don't know if I've ever really admitted this out loud or thought of it, is I'm permanently damaged by the 14 years of horrific, hateful comments. Now, I'm not talking about people who have criticisms. I'm not talking about people who have constructive feedback. I'm not talking about people who occasionally lose their temper with me, but then apologize or whatever. That's not what I'm talking. I'm talking about some just really awful things, just messages that give the idea that someone just absolutely hates you. Someone just absolutely knows and believes that you are an evil, horrific human being. And not only that, but they band together with other people and they work against you. I consider myself a pretty confident, I would like to think of myself as a healthy person, and I do everything I can to protect myself from whatever sort of negative effects there have been from that. I do a lot of emotional regulation. I do a lot of support. I do a lot of reaching out. I have full systems. So here's another thing that I hired Alina on the podcast. Probably a good 60% of the reason why I hired Alina, my brother's kid, is because of this reason, because I want to be able to interact with the comment section and with emails and stuff, but I also cannot handle being traumatized. Like I would have this experience where, I don't know if I ever talked about this micro, but I would say, look at the comments of a YouTube video, or I would go into my DMs on Instagram or something. And, 99 times out of 100, it's neutral or positive. And I would go in there and I'd, start looking around and reply or just read or whatever. And then every once in a while, boom, this thing would happen. And I work basically 24/7. So, if I have something to do on the podcast and it's like midnight, I don't not do it because it's off business hours. Like I'm basically just occasionally always checking, and maybe, that's a problem, but I, I'll check it out. I'll just have a wild hair at midnight on a random Wednesday, and I'll be like, oh, I wonder what is going on in the comment section of that one video. I wonder what people thought of it. So, I go look at it, and again, most of the time everything's fine, but every once in a while, boom. And then I can't sleep that night because of some very angry, hurtful comment. And when I think about it, it's the comments where people make super, if someone says something like, oh my God, what he just said, that was so stupid. Like those kind of comments, they're not great, but they don't really get under my skin, because I'm like, well, yeah, they thought one thing was stupid that I said. I say stupid things or whatever. But it's the comments that are just like I saw one recently where people were fighting with each other. I think it seemed like it was. And one person was accusing the other people for being like cult members of mine or something. And that got under my skin, clearly, because I saw it, I don't know, a long time ago, and it's still kind of rattling around in my head. It's not a direct observation to me. They're mainly attacking another listener to the podcast, but what I took away from it was, wait, this person thinks that I have a cult and that I'm a cult leader and that, I'm manipulating people to be in my cult so that I could control people in this malicious, horrific, like, what? And it's that, and that's just one of a million kinds of things. But anyway, point is that would happen to me, and then I would pull away from the, I would start putting it in my calendar and reminding myself, don't look at the comments section, because I would be tempted. And this would happen hundreds of times where I would be lulled into a state of being okay with the comments. And so I'd go back to a month later, after I kind of forgot about how horrible it was for that week when that comment got under my skin, I go back to the comments section, and for a few weeks, everything's fine. And then boom, this one comment will come out of the blue and it'll knock me off my feet, and my week is ruined or my day is ruined, and it'll affect the content that I make. I'll be more tentative, or I'll spend 10 times the amount of hours editing everything, making sure that there's nothing in there that could be criticized, or I feel like I don't have the motivation to even make content because it just doesn't feel good to worry about being slapped across the face metaphorically or emotionally like that. So I won't feel good about making content. It's rough. And then so I hired Alina to actually do a lot of things, but also to look at the comments and let me know if a comment section is actually okay for me to look at, which sounds just ridiculous, but it is what it is. And maybe it's something to do with me and my OCPD and my insecurities. It does, obviously, but I contend that it's universal to all content providers. Everyone has different levels of tolerance, but a good example of this is that Umberto, for example, he comes across as a very carefree, very confident person, and he would say that he is. And in the beginning, I would ask him, because he would get bad comments every now and then, and I would ask him how he deals with it. He'd just be like, well, I just don't really care. I just let it roll off my back. And I always admired that and try to figure out, okay, how do I get like that? But over time, I've actually seen the comments get under his skin. I think for him in the beginning, he just hadn't experienced much of what I had experienced. And over time, now he's different now. I see him, and he'll play it down. He'll say yeah, I'm fine, but I can tell that, and I've asked him point blank, and he'll confirm that he has a similar reaction that I do, even though he comes across like he's carefree and confident and above it all. I don't think anyone is. A prime example of this is I'm a big fan of Conan O'Brien, and years and years ago, I remember him talking about how he doesn't read reviews about him. He doesn't read any comments about him ever. He has a super famous big podcast now, similar. He doesn't read any of the reviews. He doesn't read comments. And people love Conan O'Brien, so you'd think, well, why wouldn't you read it? Well, he's talked about it. It's not the same, but a similar kind of experience for me. So all this is to say that when you were 11 and you were probably experiencing, it sounds like 100 times the toxicity that I have ever experienced. Yeah, that is going to get on your skin. It's going to, even though it's the same when we're being yelled at by our parents or our boss at work. There's a part of us that knows that the other person is irrational and unfair and ridiculous. No, I'm not a stupid idiot. That person is wrong. But we are not computers. We're not able to completely cut that out. We are affected by the way we're treated. We're affected by how people treat us, at what people say about us, how people think about us, what we think they think about us, in both positive and negative ways. If I know that people accept me and don't reject me, that gives me self-esteem. It gives me fuel to take on the world. And the opposite is true as well. If I think that people are against me, it sucks the fuel out of me, So, yeah. And for you, when you were 11, should you have been on the internet? I would say no. I mean, maybe you could make an argument, because you didn't tell the full story, that it was an overall good for you, but, and maybe that was true, but at the very least, you should have had someone by your side who cared about you and loved you, who could mentor you and protect you, someone who could moderate your comment section before you looked at it or something like that. You deserved that. You should have had your own Alina. All right, let's take a break. When we get back, more questions. All right, we're back from the break. Let's do an OPP, y'all. These people became patrons all the way back in 2020 and have stayed patrons as loyal listeners to the podcast. We have upper tier annual patron Jessica from Vineyard, Utah. We got annual patron Victoria from Seattle, Washington. I know that place. We have annual patron Melissa from Australia. We have Jessica from Tennessee. We have Lisa, Shaden, Sarah, Greg, Megan from God knows where. We have Annette, upper tier annual patron Annette from, I believe, Latvia. In fact, I think I read one of your emails recently. We have, I think it's Latvia, LV. We have Kristen from Maryland. We have Brenna from California. We got Danielle from Virginia. We got annual patron Katie from Redmond, Washington, another place that I know a lot about. Grew up right by there. We have Thomas from Australia. We got Elaine, Carl, and Patreon Duck from God knows where. We have Kayla from California. We got Noemi from Ohio. We got JV from Saskatoon, Canada, right? I almost said California because it was CA, but Saskatoon, that's Canada, right? We got annual upper tier patron Petya from Bulgaria. We have Nina from Seattle, and we have annual patron Alexandra from Irvine, California, which is where my uncle used to live. Thank you for being a patron, y'all, and staying a patron through thick and thin. Truly. Patron numbers have been dipping a little bit lately, full disclosure, so it freaks me out. And so for the people that have stuck around, it makes me feel a lot more secure in my future to pay my bills. All right, this next email is from anonymous upper tier patron. She says, "Hi, Kirk. I know you have talked about this many, many times, but here I am, confused about my own attachment style. My therapist seems to agree with me that I have disorganized attachment style, but she's not someone who guides me a lot. So I thought I would ask you. I know you can't diagnose me, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. I have an extensive history of childhood neglect and trauma, and there wasn't a single adult who was able to be a safe attachment to me when I was young. Both my mother and my father were abusive to me. As a result, I seem to not ever be able to trust other people, but also not ever be able to trust myself, and I have a lot of self-hatred." So just chiming in here, yeah, that's straight down the middle, disorganized attachment. You're very self-aware, by the way. And the way it's conceptualized by the experts dating back 50 years is that the working models are such that you both have a negative working model of others and a negative working model of the self, which you described. You don't trust other people, and you also don't trust the self. And that's the configuration for disorganized attachment. You go on to say, "I surely do exhibit both anxious and avoidant traits. I fear vulnerability, but sometimes I can get extremely close to people, and then I get this vulnerability hangover after, and I'm terrified of what I have done. I tend to push and pull people away. I have been called hot and cold many times. I can feel both preoccupied and avoidant at exactly the same time, and this inner conflict leads to tremendous amount of fear and confusion. It's like I'm not sure whether I should lean forward or run away, so I just mentally freeze and often panic. Would you consider my description as a sign of having disorganized attachment style?" End of email. Yes. The short answer is you're describing a quintessential textbook example of disorganized attachment. And I understand that when you hear descriptions of both preoccupied and avoidant attachment, you're like, well, what about that? No, you're describing straight down the middle textbook. And I'm sorry that you're going through this. It is a rough condition. I'm glad you're in therapy. So yeah, you feel vulnerability 100%, but sometimes you get extremely close to people. Right. And then you have a vulnerability hangover, and after you're terrified of what you've done. That's kind of a key to disorganized and fearful attachment, is that you are desperate for closeness, you will get close, and then immediately in the moment or afterwards, you feel tremendous fear and terror. People with preoccupied attachment and avoidant, they don't necessarily feel that amount of terror. They could, but that description right there is indicative 100% of disorganized attachment. You say you tend to push and then pull people away. You're hot and cold. You feel preoccupied and avoidant at the exact same time. And then here's kind of the key. You say, it's like I'm not sure whether I should lean forward or run away, so I just mentally freeze and often panic. That is quintessential disorganized fearful attachment. When I describe it to students and to clients, that's basically the phrasing that I use, that when the child was young, they wanted for you, in all likelihood this is true for you, that children have an instinct to run towards their attachment figures, which is often their parents, their caregivers, because that is the secure base. That is most often the place where they will be taken care of and attuned to and protected and safe and secure. And the child moves away from the caregivers to explore the world in various different ways, mentally and physically, to grow and individuate and experience and learn. And then something scary happens, as inevitably will, and the child runs back to the parent and then roams away from the parent, runs back, roams away, runs back. And this process happens throughout the lifespan. An 18-year-old will go off to college, but when things go bad, she'll call home and cry and say she had a bad time in class or something like that. That's move away, explore, learn, individuate, come back, secure base. And when the child is very young, they do this in a very obvious way, visible way. But when the child is being abused by the parents, the child is stuck between a rock and a hard place because they are instinctually wanting to run away from the threat and run toward the parent, the caregiver. But what if the parent is the threat? So the child doesn't know what to do. Instinctually, they have no idea what to do. Emotionally, they have no idea what to do. Physically, they have no idea how to behave, where to run. So they want to run towards the parents because the parents are the safe haven, supposedly, but the parents are the threat. The parents are the ones being the scary monster. So the child freezes and shuts down or freaks out or something, because they also don't want to run away from the parent, because instinctually they feel as though running away from the parent is even more of a threat. But they can't run away from the parent, but they need to run away from the parent because the parent is the threat. So they don't know what to do. So when you just say, I'm not sure whether I should lean forward or run away, so I just mentally freeze and off to panic. Yeah, that's straight down the middle, disorganized. Feeling preoccupied and avoiding it at exactly the same time. Yeah, that's preoccupied, or that's disorganized. Right, this next email is from annual upper tier patron, anonymous patron from Beirut. She says, I saw the video you posted about the abuse of Amaranth. This was a hard one to watch, as I have a cycle of entering unhealthy relationships. My ex once swerved his car towards the edge of a mountain because I was scared of his speeding. I always worry that I'm going to trigger my therapist with the stuff I have gone through. My therapist doesn't disclose for their own ethical reasons, but out of curiosity, how do therapists who have been abused navigate clients describing the details of their own abuse? Do they ever get triggered in the middle of session? If so, what are the go-to strategies they use to soothe themselves in that moment? Is this covered in graduate school? End of email. Yeah, good question. Well, the first thing is that you shouldn't be worrying about triggering your client. You shouldn't be worried about triggering your therapist. That is your therapist's responsibility 100%. So, and if you're particularly concerned, just ask your therapist. You'd be like, so do I ever trigger you? I'm sorry, you can ask that question. But that is not your responsibility, and therapists need to work on their own stuff to be able to handle this, and maybe not take clients that have traumas like this because of their own vulnerabilities. Because, a lot of people have triggers, a lot of people have PTSD. Having said that, does it ever happen in the middle of session? Yeah, absolutely. Therapists, like I said, all of us have our own relational traumas. It's just a matter of degree, and absolutely therapists can become triggered in the middle of session. And then you say, is it covered in grad school? My first answer to that is, yeah, of course it's covered in grad school. But then when I think about it, and of course I only have my own experience and the little bit of research I've read in this area to guide me. But yes, it's covered in graduate school, but I would imagine that a lot of people graduate from graduate school having very little contact and education in this area. I would like to think that that's not true, but it could be true. I'd like to think for myself, like there's no specific class on this topic or even an umbrella class. Like in my program, we have kind of a rare class that's based on family of origin work, and you would potentially discuss that vulnerability in that class. Hopefully you would. But it's not a guarantee. I mean, if the student doesn't bring it up, then the professor doesn't know to highlight it, right? So that's one class, but there's not usually just a class of just like how to handle vicarious trauma or how to handle your own PTSD and how to avoid being triggered in session. Now, hopefully when you start practicing, your supervisor gets into that with you, and you as a trainee share that with your supervisor. But it's not a guarantee, and your supervisor might not be very good at guiding people on that. So I'm going to take a guess and say that most therapists are not trained well enough. Having said that, I would like to think that at least by the time people start getting into their mid-career, they would have come across literature or knowledge or understanding that would guide them to work on this and to take care of themselves so that they can, one, just protect themselves from their clients' traumas, but also they could stay present and helpful to their clients if they are potentially at risk of being triggered or triggered. So I don't know. But I would guess that most therapists understand what's going on. At least I'd like to hope so. Then you ask, what are the go-to strategies to soothe the self in the moment? It's complicated. There's a lot of different things one could do. I mean, there's thousands of things. Differentiation techniques, relaxation techniques, self-awareness, emotional regulation, maybe even just kind of checking out for a bit. I've done that before. I don't have PTSD, but something might happen that might kind of shock me or be a distraction, and I'll go inward. And for maybe a couple of minutes, I consciously know that I'm not being the best listener, but I'll be nodding my head as the client is talking or something, but I'm kind of pushed off kilter, and I am trying to gather myself and return to empathy and listening again. And maybe I don't hear that well or retain the information that well for those 2 minutes. That can happen. That's not great, but sometimes it's better than just stopping the session altogether and being, okay, hold on, I need to take a break for 5 minutes because I was just triggered. It's always a cost-benefit analysis. And but that doesn't have, I literally can't remember the last time that happened to me. I don't even know if it ever happened to me, honestly, when I think about it. But if it had, it would have been maybe 10, 15 years ago or something. Actually, I do remember one client that might have done this to me, might have made me go inward a little bit, like, interesting. All right, this next email is from upper tier patron Jeremy from California. He says, Dear Dr. Kirk, do you have any guidelines for people who have crushes on their friends or other unavailable people? What are the rules for behaving ethically, acknowledging one's emotions, managing friendships, and leading a healthy romantic life while crushing on someone who already has a partner? End of question. Jeremy literally included end of question at the end at the end of his question, which is great. So, end of question, end of email. Yeah, it's complicated. So you're asking guidelines for people who have crushes on their friends or other unavailable people. It depends on everyone involved. And in some scenarios, you could tell your friend or your coworker or something. Well, coworker. You could tell your friend because you knew that they would react well about it. You'd be like, by the way, I've always had a crush on you. And your friend could be like totally fine with that. It could not affect them negatively. But there is a risk, right? And you want to err on the side of caution. But, telling someone about it could really concern them, could scare them, could make them feel awkward around you. And but it also depends on the situation. Like if you're totally in love with someone and you just can't bear it, that's one version of a crush. And another crush is just like, I'm lonely and I sure wish that she would date me, but she has a boyfriend, but maybe one day she'll date me. That's different. So case by case, but generally speaking, the overall solution is that you fix your attachment life such that, because I don't know I don't know if there is research on this, but in my anecdotal experience, if you are having problematic crushes, it's because there's a hole in your heart that needs to be filled with attachment and romance and companionship and love. And in lieu of that, you'd rather crush on someone. But if you have that hole filled by someone that is actually there for you and loves you back, then anecdotally, you're not going to crush on other people, at least to the degree, maybe not at all. If you had someone in your corner that made you feel loved, that made you feel attractive, that made you feel accepted and stable over time, and it was a mutual relationship, then there's not room in your heart to crush on other people. So that's one of the rules, is that you take care of yourself and do what you got to do to make sure that you're at least heading down the road to have that happen for you. The other thing is to not entertain the ideas, because if the person is unavailable, they're unavailable. And you're just harming yourself and potentially the other person by entertaining the idea. You know, some people, if you've ever been the target of an unwanted crush, especially if it's happened more than once, it feels bad. You know, there are a lot of women out there and people, but I know a lot of women out there who have had that experience where a lot of strange crushes will just emerge, or literally every guy or many of the men that they interact with, whether it's at work or friends, or even like their friend's boyfriend, they will, for whatever reason, their vibe or something, they will get a lot of crushes from people. And over time, it can feel like, is that all I'm worth to men? Is that all I am to men? Is just a potential romantic and sexual partner? Like, can't I just be a friend? Can't I just be a coworker? So it can harm a lot of people. And the way you can try to curb it is to just not entertain it in your mind. You have the feelings, you know, I'm just thinking about for myself. I imagine, I can't remember a specific, but I can remember feeling this emerging feeling of just like, a little bit of an attraction or a romantic curiosity. But in those situations that I'm talking about, I will quickly just discount it and be like, well, stop that. It's not helpful to go down that road. And for me anyway, it just ends. Maybe it's sort of lingering in the background, but I don't entertain it. I don't let it drive my behavior. I don't let it rattle around in my brain. I don't start fantasizing or imagining what it would be like with them. And as a result, I think it just dissipates, or it just kind of fades into the background, and the primary relationship, the real relationship, comes to the forefront. So I think those are some ethical rules to follow. But again, those are hard things to do. And if you're lonely and you don't have someone, then it's going to be hard to modulate those feelings. And the solution is to have a companion, have someone that crushes back on you. Right? All right, well, that is it for that episode. Slowly working my way through at least the upper tier patron emails. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really, really do.